The worst times to be born in human history. You might think you have things pretty hard right now, but if you have a roof over your head, access to clean water and electricity, and people around you that care about you, you've got a lot to be grateful for. A lot of the modern luxuries that we take for granted today didn't even exist 100 years ago, which just makes you think, if almost everything I enjoy right now didn't exist 100 years ago, what did life look like 1,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago? Well, in this video, we are going to dive into all the worst time periods to ever be born into. Everybody knows that the Roman Empire fell, but not many people talk about the time between the Roman Empire falling and the beginning of the Middle Ages. This period of time is referred to as the Late Antiquity, and it is a major time of political instability and a huge power shift in global politics at the time. Late Antiquity typically refers to anywhere from 200 AD to 700 AD, but for this section specifically, I'm going to be focusing on like 450 AD to 700 AD, because following the official end of the Roman Empire in 476 AD, a lot of things continued to happen and change until the end of the Late Antiquity in the beginning of the Middle Ages. Whenever there is a large change in almost any aspect of life, there is growing pains associated with it, because change is scary and difficult. And in the context of the Late Antiquity, anybody living in the Roman Empire was experiencing a huge cultural, political, and spiritual shift that had not been seen realistically for hundreds of years. This topic is undoubtedly extremely complex and nuanced, but I'm going to do my best to provide as much context as possible to describe why this time period would have sucked to be born and live in. And one of the biggest reasons for a lot of the hardships that people faced during this time was the widespread political instability, specifically because the empire that had controlled and mismanaged the entire geographical area for the last hundreds of years was no longer, meaning that by default, there was a power vacuum that people were hungry to fill. And of course, with the fall of one of the most iconic empires of all time, you also lose a lot of long-standing institutions, specifically armies, defense, banking, really anything that provided safety and stability to the people of Rome. Even before the fall of the Roman Empire, Rome was consistently under attack from different groups. But during the Late Antiquity, there was much less resources and manpower to fight off barbarian tribes like the Goths, the Vandals, the Huns, which meant that these barbarian tribes were extremely motivated because they knew that the big bad Roman Empire was not what it used to be. And what this resulted in was frequent wars, raids, and destruction across all of Europe and the Mediterranean, which for soldiers was devastating because at this point, soldiers were not as well equipped as they used to be, meaning that they were typically at a disadvantage during these attacks. And for civilians, that meant that they were simply less protected, making them vulnerable to barbarian raids, which is something you definitely do not want to be vulnerable to. On top of defenses being diminished and wars and raids being more frequent, there was also a huge economic decline, which was almost perfectly coupled with the political instability. And because of this, massive trade networks shrank. Major culturally significant cities were destroyed and abandoned, and even agriculture was affected due to these consistent invasions. We think about ancient Roman and ancient Greek ruins today as this thing that existed only far in the past, but during the Late Antiquity, major Roman and Greek cities and institutions and buildings that were active and respected only 100 or a few hundred years ago were now in ruins, with the majority of these culturally significant locations either being destroyed in raids, left to rot because there's nobody to use them or maintain them because of the city's depopulation, or if these buildings were still in decent shape in a city that was somewhat populated or repopulating, a lot of these buildings were actually deconstructed from the inside out to be used for new buildings. For example, ceramic and bricks were taken from old antiquity buildings and used to build new churches. The Late Antiquity is an interesting period of history because it is regarded as one of the most transitional periods, as it was at the dawn of the rise of Christianity. And because of that, there was a lot of conflict surrounding other religions in the area. But for that reason, a lot of people see this time period as an opportunity and as something to be celebrated. And while that is definitely something to consider, the Late Antiquity is one of the most significant examples of transitioning from the old world to the new world. And living through that was not easy whatsoever. But in case you're still not convinced that the Late Antiquity is one of the worst times to be born in and alive in, allow me to present one thing I haven't mentioned yet, the Justinianic Plague, which took place during the peak of the Late Antiquity, specifically from 550 AD to 750 AD. And this 200-year period saw a drastic decline due to this plague that took place all across the Mediterranean and was responsible for the death of tens of millions of people. This plague was happening while all of this political uncertainty was happening, all of these wars and raids were happening, all of the economic decline was happening, and all of the religious chaos was happening. All of this at the same time as a deadly plague. So yeah, the Late Antiquity is not just a casual handoff of power or an example of growing pains, and had a lot of horrible things happening at the same time. And for that reason, I thought it was a great candidate for this list. But we have a lot more to discuss, so let's keep going. Following the late Antiquity, I want to discuss a period of time that's a bit more modern. What I'm about to discuss isn't necessarily a time period, it's just a stretch of history that you would not want to be born in or live through at all. And this includes anywhere from 1914 to 1945. The first thing you're probably thinking about during this time period is the World Wars. And you're exactly right. World War I took place from 1914 to 1918. And during this time, if you were a healthy adult man, there was an extremely good chance that you were going to be sent into some of the worst hellish conditions ever imaginable. But we're just getting started. Obviously, World War I didn't only affect soldiers, as there was millions of civilian casualties as well. And it's estimated that in total, just from World War I alone, 15 to 22 million people died, with 9 to 11 million of those being military personnel and 6 to 13 million being possible civilian deaths. And that doesn't even account the injured and the displaced. But we're still only getting started. The conditions of World War I were insane. Trench warfare, machine guns, poison gas. These people did not have a quick and painless death. The people that did die died in some of the worst conditions this world has seen. But to add insult to injury, during 1918, not only was there a massive world war going on, but there was also a huge Spanish flu pandemic. And this pandemic was one of the deadliest pandemics in recorded history. And terrifyingly, sometimes killed young, healthy people in as little as 2 days. It's estimated that the Spanish flu killed at least 50 million people worldwide. Keep in mind, this is after 22 million from the First World War that just happened. Both of these major global events were extremely and almost unspeakably devastating. But we're still not done, because following World War I and following the Spanish flu pandemic, we find ourselves at the end of the 1920s, specifically 1929, when we began a time known as the Great Depression. During the Roaring 20s, most Western countries experienced massive economic prosperity and also had a huge social and cultural change post-war. But this cultural change was for the better, with a vibrant and optimistic outlook on life and the future, and everybody was making money and feeling better, and everything that was horrible and bad was behind us, right? We survived one of the biggest pandemics of all time and one of the worst wars of modern history. Of course we have something to celebrate. The bad times are behind us and everything is better, right? No. And the worst was only yet to come. 1929 was the catalyst of the Great Depression, and the Great Depression lasted through much of the 1930s. The Great Depression can be summarized by its economic, social, and psychological effects that it had on basically all of America. But it wasn't just America that was affected. This was a global economic catastrophe, and millions of lives were changed forever. At its peak in the United States, unemployment rates were as high as 25%. Businesses were closing left, right, and center, banks were failing, and because people lost their jobs, their savings, their livelihoods, and everything that they knew to be normal, people needed to adjust quickly or die. Poverty, hunger, homelessness were all extremely common during the Great Depression, as well as breadlines and soup kitchens, which were basically the government giving you rations of food, which typically weren't enough, but they helped. And it's not hard to believe that with this huge economic collapse came personal and political unease and restlessness. Any social programs that existed were now gone, which meant that the most vulnerable groups in society were now even more vulnerable. Old people, children, disabled people, anybody who wasn't fully and extremely self-reliant was now at risk. But even if you were self-reliant, there was still a huge psychological impact of this entire situation. Just imagine if 5 years ago you're experiencing the most prosperity you had in your life. You survived the plague, you survived the war, you had a business that was successful. It seemed like everything was okay. But then in October of 1929, everything changed. The bank where you stored your millions of dollars was closed. Your money was nowhere to be found. The business that you were operating was now empty because nobody was shopping, and you had to fire all of your employees. The close network of friends that you had around you was now dissipating because people were ditching town to find any sort of opportunity elsewhere. And you are left in a house that you're going to default on with people that you need to take care of, and the only option you really have is to get in the breadline and hope for the best. If nothing else, that's going to do something on your mental health. And we've even seen the effects of people who experienced and survived the Great Depression in future generations. During the Great Depression, people globally were uneasy. Everything that they felt they had worked for was taken from them. It was gone. And now most people are jobless, homeless, or at least hungry. And basically everybody was doing way worse than they were before. And this social unrest led to political unrest, which led to the rise of some pretty crazy ideologies, which brings us to the last thing I want to mention in this period of time during the early 1900s, the Second World War. As I stated earlier, the First World War is one of the most catastrophic things to happen in recent history. And the Second World War, unfortunately, was just as bad as World War I, if not much worse. The Second World War lasted longer, experienced much more death, experienced experienced genocide and so many more horrible things that weren't even possible during the First World War. Just for context, it's estimated that anywhere from 70 to 85 million people died during World War II, and it's believed that almost half of these deaths were civilian deaths, which is extremely upsetting. The Soviet Union alone lost 24 million people in World War II, which is more than all of the people lost in World War I, just for context. And once again, if you were a young, healthy man during this time, there was an extremely good chance that you were about to be exposed to hellish conditions and almost certain death. And if you were just living in Europe or Japan, there was also a good chance that no matter who you were, old, young, man, woman, you could very much so experience horrors beyond your comprehension. And the bookend on this entire period of time is the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima that ended the Second World War and killed around 200,000 people. I just described a handful of some of the most significant historical events in modern history, and all of these things happened in like a 40-year stretch. If you were born in 1898, you could have been old enough to fight at the end of World War I, experience the Spanish flu pandemic, lose all of your money in the Great Depression, and then as an adult fight in World War II as well. And by the time World War II ended, you would be 47 and have a lot of stories to tell. It's honestly just mind-boggling to think about, and for that reason, I knew it was one of the worst time periods to be born into and live in. I wanted to take a quick break from war because we've discussed a lot of it up to this point, so I wanted to talk about the year 536 AD, which is a year that, ironically, has been nominated as the worst year to be alive by Michael McCormick, who is a medieval scholar. And by medieval scholar, I don't mean he was a scholar in medieval times. I mean like he is a modern-day scholar of medieval times. Regardless, what happened in 536 AD? Well, if you paid attention to the first section, a lot, because 536 AD actually does take place during the late Antiquity. But I didn't want to discuss it in that section because I wanted to make sure I had a separate spot for, well, a volcanic winter. During 536 AD, a massive volcanic eruption took place and literally cooled the Earth's climate, specifically Europe's and China's climate. And for 18 months, across China and Europe, there was a dark sky consistently, temperatures dropping as low as 2.5 degrees Celsius. And because of that unusual decrease in temperature during these 18 months, people not only experienced severe weather anomalies, but also widespread famine. But on top of both of these things, I can only imagine how scared and concerned people were, because this volcanic eruption happened in Iceland. So people in China and medieval Europe really didn't know what was going on. They just saw clouds that came and never left. And the results of these clouds were devastating. And while we don't exactly know how many people died due to the famine and political unrest that were caused by the volcanic winter of 536 AD, this entire situation was basically just rubbing salt in the wounds of what was already happening during the late Antiquity period. And I don't want to harp on the late Antiquity so much, but let's just kind of recap. Consistent wars and raids, famine, economic collapse, a massive bubonic plague pandemic, and on top of all of this, a year and a half where the sky was just darker and everything was colder, which caused people to get really weird and squirrely, food to die, and weather to get weird. Like for example, in China, it literally snowed during the summertime. Following 536 AD, there was something known as the Late Antique Little Ice Age, which lasted from 536 to 660, because after this 18 months of the initial cloud dust that caused a volcanic winter, there was other eruptions that happened shortly after that prolonged the cooling of the Earth at this time. So even though 536 is the year that gets all the fame, there was roughly a 130-year period where the Earth was just colder, and it was literally known as a Little Ice Age. Ridiculous. Fast forwarding out of the late Antiquity period for the second time, we're now moving on into the mid-1300s when medieval Europe is in full swing and we are now experiencing one of the most devastating pandemics of all time, the Black Death. In all of Europe and even areas outside of Europe from 1347 to 1351, basically nobody was safe from one of the deadliest pandemics to ever happen. Now, we've already discussed the bubonic plague that took place during the late Antiquity period, but I had to discuss the Black Death because it was so culturally significant and it was so devastating. So I'm going to make this part short, but I had to mention it. During this roughly 4-year period, the Black Death wiped out an estimated 30 to 60% of all of Europe's population, which is almost unfathomable to think about. In numbers, the death toll is estimated to be around 50 million in Europe and up to potentially 200 million globally. Like, let's just say it killed an average of 50% of people in Europe. That means 1 in 2 people were killed by the plague in only a few-year period. That is so hard to even imagine. And on top of the sheer terrifying nature of half of the people that were living now dying, there's also massive social and political impacts because of the Black Death, adding gas to the fire of this already out of control situation. And it's for that reason that being alive during the mid-1300s would be one of the worst times to ever be born or live in general, because everybody was terrified of the disease that was going around. Nobody knew how to properly treat or prevent this disease. Half of everybody you know is dying from this disease. And if you were to be born in this setting, it must have seemed like the world was just ending around you. And for that reason, it's more than obvious why you would have not wanted to been born or live during this period of time. And seeing as disease and pandemics are inescapable on this list, I do have another example to discuss. And it takes place during the late 1400s. But this is a time that is specifically tragic for a specific group of people: Native Americans. Europeans decided to take a trip over to America, and it ended in 95% of all indigenous populations effectively being wiped out, because Americans were immune to and carried diseases that the Native Americans have never seen before. But it wasn't only the diseases that made the colonization of the Americas so devastating for the Native Americans, but it was also the social and religious and cultural aspects of the entire colonization by the Europeans. If you were a Native American living anywhere in North America, basically any time after 1492 was a really tragic time to be born and alive. As I mentioned previously, when the Europeans began to colonize Americas, the spread of old world diseases such as smallpox led to one of the deadliest biological disasters basically ever recorded. It's estimated that up to 55 million or 95% of Native Americans passed away just from diseases alone. But that's really where the suffering began. If you were an indigenous person during the time of colonization, not only did you experience the widespread disease, but also widespread violence, displacement, and essentially destruction. The Europeans at this point already had gunpowder, and now they realized that they had an unintentional bioweapon that they could use at will. And because of this, many indigenous groups were simply at the mercy of the Europeans that were colonizing their land, which meant that people were moved out of places that they've lived for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Wars took place on people that were already weak and had low morale, and the entire Native American way of life was not only in jeopardy, but on the verge of being destroyed forever. The settlers and explorers from Europe that were living in the Americas didn't have an easy life either. But compared to what the indigenous people experienced during this time, it's not even comparable. And keep in mind, these European explorers and settlers, they chose to embark on this mission. The Native Americans didn't ask for any of this. They were living their own life until the Europeans inserted themselves and brought over germs and steel. And even to this very day, you can still see the effects of this colonization on Native American communities. The colonization of the Americas is another example of an extremely harsh and tragic transition period that happened throughout history. And for better or for worse, it happened. And to have lived or been born as a Native American during this time, it would have been extremely hard and tragic. And for that reason, I had to put it on this list. And for the last time in this video, I actually wanted to discuss an entire time period. And I saved it for the end because it might not fit the criteria for some people, as this time period is prehistoric. And it's also pre-human. It's known as the Carboniferous Period, and it took place from 539 million BC to 299 million BC. And while humans didn't exist during this time period, if you were to have been born in this time period, you would have been wishing you weren't. The Earth was much different hundreds of millions of years ago, with one of the most notable changes being the oxygen level being much higher than it is today. As of right now, the air we breathe is only roughly 21% oxygen, but during the Carboniferous Period, the air was 35% oxygen, which sounds great, until you remember that oxygen is actually highly flammable, which meant that during this time period where forests were rich and lush, massive forest fires took place and would rage uncontrollably, sometimes for months or years on end. But that's only the start to some of the Carboniferous shenanigans. Because sure, if you were to be born in this time period, the air alone would cause health issues and would likely cause oxygen toxicity over time, but potentially that's something you could acclimate to. Scientists let me know. But forest fires aside, you would have been faced with some of the most devastating and disgusting creatures of all time. Keep in mind, the Carboniferous period is far before the dinosaurs. So if there was no humans and no dinosaurs, what was roaming the earth? And the answer is insects and arthropods. And these creatures thrived in this oxygen-rich environment, which meant that they could grow to insane sizes. That's right, the Carboniferous period was essentially a time when the entire planet was overrun by huge bugs. there was giant dragonflies that had wingspans that were over 2 feet long. And there was over 3.5-foot long millipedes that would just be crawling around. And these are only 2 examples of some of the creatures that existed during this time. This time period is also known as the Golden Age of Sharks, which as a human means that it's definitely not the golden age for you, which is just another reason why this entire period of time would be horrible to be a human, or alive as a human for that matter. But in case the prosperity of sharks and giant bugs weren't enough to kind of creep you out, there was also mega arachne, because of course there was. And what that means is there was giant spiders. Spiders that got as big as a human head, which, I mean, I guess comparably to the size of the other animals I discussed isn't that big, but I mean, I don't want to touch any spider, let alone a spider the size of my head. Even though the Carboniferous period likely would have been extremely beautiful, with the rich oxygen causing lush rainforests and greenery to thrive globally, due to the residents of the earth at this time, you would have definitely not wanted to experience it. But I'm curious, out of everything I discussed in this video, which time do you think was the absolute worst, and why? Let me know in the comments below. And if you guys loved this video and this concept, I'd be more than happy to make a second part, because while researching for this video, I found a plethora of horrible times to exist as a human. And I had to leave some on the chopping block because I can't make a video that's, 2 hours long. But I can make follow-ups if you guys want it. And with that being said, if you enjoyed this video, check out the video on screen right now. It's a video about how you would die on every planet in our solar system. Thank you guys so much for watching, and as always, trust me, bro.